Hi folks, this is Karim Raouf from Raati Visualizer channel. We will continue our lab, the matrix labs, in the video number 66. We have been discussing in the previous video the following. We are still working with the Purple Knight Active Directory Security Assessment tool, which is a free tool you can download, and we see the report generated by this tool, and we have stopped at this section of the report concerning the corpus security indicators or tests. We have stopped at this security indicator, which is called objects with constrained delegation configured. We have talked about this topic the previous video, constrained delegation or corpus constrained delegation. This is to delegate a service to talk to another service on behalf of a certain user. This is most commonly used when you see a web server that has a database attached to it. So you can make the web server service to talk to the KDC or key distribution center, okay, to take a ticket on behalf of the user to access the database server attached to this web server. Okay, so instead of the user going to the KDC to take a ticket to allow it to access the web server, then again talking to the KDC to take a service ticket to allow it to access the database on the web server, this is done by the web server. He needs only to take a ticket to access the web server, and then the web server will take a ticket on behalf of the user to access the database attached to it. This will make a seamless experience, so this will make the user accessing the web server and the attached database easy in a very easy way. For example, maybe the user needs to access the web server, then put an order. Okay, maybe he is putting a purchase order, so this purchase order needs to be written to the database, so he needs to have access to, or the access need to have access to the database server, so he needs to authenticate, or he needs to take permission to access the database service. So this is done through the constrained delegation. Here he is seeking if there is any object. I think here object here is talking about attributes concerning the user accounts or the computer accounts. He's looking for a specific attribute. Okay, this is called MSDS, allowed to delegate to. He's seeking any object, especially user objects or computer objects that have this attribute have a value. If you have a value concerning this attribute, then this object, which can be a user or a computer, is delegated or have constrained delegation, or it is delegated to talk to another services on behalf of the user. So why is seeking that? To make sure that you focus very carefully on these objects or these accounts, because if they are hacked, then a hacker can compromise your security in your domain. So here, attacks may utilize delegation to move laterally or escalate privileges if they compromise a service that is trusted to delegate. We have seen this here, for example, on our web server example. He can hack the web server and then use this web server, okay, to hack the database server attached to it. So we know that the web server can take a ticket and use it on behalf of the user, okay, to access the database. So he can hack this account, and then he can take a ticket to access the database server, and further he can see the credentials for the user that the web server is trying to take a ticket on his behalf to access the database server. So there is a lot of things here going on. We need to make sure that delegated or accounts with delegated or constrained delegation should be monitoring closely, and we need to have a monitoring system to monitor these accounts, okay, because this is very critical. Okay, if you ask the AI tools to give us examples, just to refresh your mind, we have talked about this concept before, but if you ask Perplexity, here I ask it to give me a prompt, or I give him a prompt to explain what is object with constrained delegation. So here, this was the answer of Perplexity. Then we will see the answer of ChatGPT 01, and then we will see the answer of Claude 3.5 Sonnet. So let's read the answer and see uh, how this is explained using the AI tools. Okay, if we go there and see like this, okay, now we can read it loudly. As we can see here, there is here, if you open any user account or computer account, you will see here, if we go further, this is the tab for the delegation. If you go there, if you go up and up and up and up, this tab, you will see it in the user account or computer account. In the delegation tab, you can delegate or make this service or this user account or service account or computer account talk to certain services uh, you define, or you can use also Kerberos, or it can also authenticate using Kerberos to this. So if it needs to talk to these services, you should authenticate to the domain controller using the KDC or using the Kerberos protocol. Anyway, so we will try to see the answer and read it loudly.
In the context of Active Directory AD for a domain named matrix.internal, understanding the implications of constrained delegation is crucial for maintaining security.
Sorry guys, let's continue the answer.
Constrained delegation allows specific service accounts to impersonate users to access particular services on their behalf, but it comes with risks if not managed properly. What is constrained delegation? Constrained delegation is a feature in Active Directory that limits the services a service account can access on behalf of a user. When configured, it uses two key attributes. MSDS allowed to delegate to. This attribute specifies which services the account can delegate to. User account control. This attribute must not have the protocol transition bits set, meaning it cannot use the less secure method of delegation. Real-world example. Imagine you have a web application running on a server in your matrix.internal domain that needs to access a SQL database to retrieve user data. You configure the web server service account with constrained delegation so that it can impersonate users only to access the SQL database service. Configuration. You set the MSDS allowed to delegate to attribute of the web server service account to include only the SQL database's service principal name, SPN. This means that when users log into the web application, their credentials are used by the web server to access only the SQL database, not any other resources in the domain. Security implications. If an attacker compromises this web server service account, and it has strong passwords, they can impersonate any user to access the SQL database, but cannot access other services or resources beyond what is defined in MSDS allowed to delegate to. This containment reduces risk compared to unconstrained delegation, where an attacker could access any service within the domain. Likelihood of compromise. While constrained delegation is more secure than unconstrained delegation, it is not immune to attacks. If an attacker gains access to an account with constrained delegation configured, for example, through phishing or exploiting weak passwords, they can leverage this access for lateral movement within your network. Example of attack scenario. An attacker compromises the web server service account. They use tools like Mimikatz or Kikyo to request Kerberos tickets that allow them to impersonate users. With these tickets, they can query sensitive data from the SQL database or even escalate privileges if those accounts have higher privileges in AD. Mitigation strategies. To mitigate risks associated with constrained delegation, regularly audit accounts with constrained delegation configured. Ensure strong password policies are enforced for these accounts. Monitor logs for unusual access patterns or modifications to delegation settings. By understanding and managing constrained delegation effectively within your matrix.internal domain, you can enhance security while allowing necessary functionality for applications and services.
So this is the answer of Perplexity. If we go and see where this delegation is done, we can see it is done through the properties of the computer or the user account or the service account. Then we can go trust this computer for delegation to a specific service. You can use the Kerberos authentication protocol as your mean to talk to the domain controller, so you can authenticate using the Kerberos or any other protocol, but this is less secure. You need to make it Kerberos, and you are defining the service that you will talk to. maybe a SQL database or any other service. So this is the answer of Perplexity. If you go to ChatGPT and ask it to explain the same concept, if you go further and ask it to explain this one, let's see what will be the answer.
Understanding constrained delegation in Active Directory with a real-world example in matrix.internal. Background. In an Active Directory AD environment like Matrix Internal, services often need to access resources on behalf of a user. Delegation allows a service to impersonate user accounts to access resources they are authorized to use. There are two main types of delegation. 1. Unconstrained delegation. The service can impersonate users to any service in the domain. This poses a high security risk if the service is compromised. 2. Constrained delegation. The service can impersonate users only to specific services defined in its settings. This is more secure as it limits the scope of impersonation. Key attributes. MSDS allowed to delegate to. This AD attribute specifies which services an account is allowed to delegate to. It's used in configuring constrained delegation. User account control bit for protocol transition, a setting that, when enabled, allows a service to use any authentication protocol to request tickets to other services on behalf of a user. Disabling this reduces risk by limiting the protocols that can be used. Real-world example in matrix.internal. Let's consider a practical scenario involving the domain matrix.internal. Scenario: web server, webmo1.matrix.internal, application server, appletate matrix.internal, database server, db01.matrix objective. Users access a web application hosted on Web1. This web application needs to access services on Applo1 and retrieve data from DB01 on behalf of the user. Configuration steps. 1. Setting up constrained delegation on Web1. Delegation configuration. In Active Directory users and computers, ADUC, locate the computer account for Web1. Enable delegation. Set Web01 to be trusted for delegation to specified services only. Specify services. Add the MSDS allowed to delegate to entries for the services on AP01 and DB01 that Web1 needs to access. For example, http01.matrix.internal, MSSQL SVC db01.matrixinks.internal of 133. Ensuring protocol transition is not enabled. User account control settings. Verify that the user account control attribute for Web01 does not have the protocol transition bit set, does not include the trusted to authenticate for delegation flag. Result: this ensures Web01 can only delegate credentials using Kerberos and cannot use other, potentially less secure protocols. Security implications. Controlled access. By specifying exact services in MSDS allowed to delegate to, Well1 can only delegate credentials to App01 and DB01. Risk mitigation. Not enabling protocol transition reduces the attack surface, as attackers cannot exploit other protocols to gain unauthorized access. Likelihood of compromise and mitigation. Attack scenario: compromised service. If an attacker gains control over Web01, they can impersonate users to access App01 and DB01 only, as per the constrained delegation settings. Lateral movement. The attacker could potentially extract sensitive data from DB01 or manipulate services on AppP01. Mitigation strategies. 1. Strong passwords. Service accounts. Ensure that any service accounts involved have strong, complex passwords. Regular updates. Change passwords regularly and enforce password policies. 2. Regular auditing. Review delegations. Periodically audit all accounts with constrained delegation configured. Validate necessity. Confirm that each delegation is still required for business operations. 3. Monitor MSDS allowed to delegate to attribute checks. Use scripts or tools to list all accounts with this attribute set. Alerting. Set up alerts for any changes to delegation settings. 4. Limit administrative access. Least privilege principle. Only grant administrative rights to those who absolutely need them. Multi-factor authentication. Implement MFA for accounts with administrative privileges. Conclusion. In the matrix.internal domain, configuring constrained delegation properly is crucial for maintaining security. Understand the scope. Know which services are specified in the MSDS allowed to delegate to attribute. Manage protocols. Ensure that protocol transition is disabled unless explicitly required. Prevent abuse. Recognize that while constrained delegation limits potential abuse, it doesn't eliminate it. Attackers can still exploit misconfigurations or weak passwords. Final note. By carefully managing constrained delegation and maintaining strong security practices, organizations can significantly reduce the risk of attackers using these delegations to move laterally or escalate privileges within the network.
Very, very good answer, and more elaborating than the answer of perplexity. We can see the example is more clear, the meditation steps is more clear, so it is good explanation by ChatGPT o1. Let's see Claude and his answer. If we go and try to ask the same question, let's go and see here the answer. So here you go, this is the answer. Okay, here is the answer concerning also the explanation of principles. No, not this is the one, sorry guys. If you go further, security delegation, if you go further, here it is, this is the one. Let's read the answer. Okay, I think we need to go further back. Okay, if you go there and try to tell him to read loudly, if there's something in Firefox for read out loudly, I don't think so. Take a screenshot, view, inspect. Okay, so let's read it by ourselves. Here we can see terminology. First, what MSDS allowed to delegate to? Active Directory attribute that specifies which services an account can delegate to. User account control, a set of flags that control account behavior in Active Directory. Protocol transition, feature allowing a service to switch from one authentication protocol to another. Constrained delegation, restricted form of credential delegation limited to specific service. Very, very good explanation. Literal movement between different systems in a network. Service principal name, unique identifier for a service instant. Let's try to explain this using layman terms. Imagine you are running a hotel, your network. Some staff members, services have special key cards, delegation rights that let them enter specific rooms, other services on behalf of the guest, the users. Very, very good example. These special key cards are restricted. They only work on certain doors. Constrained delegation. However, if an attacker or a thief steals one of the special keys or staff keys, they could access those specific rooms even though they are not supposed to. It is safer than giving staff master keys. So here is talking about unconstrained delegation. So here is giving staff constrained access to certain rooms, not unconstrained access. Okay, but you still need to be careful who get these special key cards and make sure they keep them extra secure. So this is the explanation of constrained delegation and how, if it is misused, it can compromise our network security. Now let's explain it in technical terms. In Active Directory environment, constrained delegation configuration are implemented through this attribute of the user or the computer object, which explicitly defines the service principal name to which the principal can delegate. We can see here, this is where we can delegate something. Here is the tab that we will configure through it the delegation. Okay, so here let's continue. Without protocol transition, okay, this is abbreviation is the service to the user himself. So here is talking about that the user should communicate with the KDC directly to get a service ticket. Okay, this is what we mean by service for user to himself or to himself enabled. The service must receive a valid Kerberos ticket from the user. So for example, to accessing the web server, you need to get a ticket from the KDC. Okay, this is the first phase. When an attacker compromises a service account with constrained delegation rights, they can potentially leverage a user for proxy, which is a service talking to another service on behalf of the user. So these two terms. The first term is the user talking to the service directly, and the other one is the user talking to the service through another service. So this is S4U to proxy and S4U to self. Okay, anyway, so he's talking that you can potentially leverage S4U2 proxy to request service tickets for the allowed SPN. So if you hacked the web server, you can web server service, you can take a service ticket to access the database attached to this web server on behalf of other users. Okay, enabling targeted lateral movement within the delegation constraints. Okay, and then he is giving us an example, okay, concerning how to explain this topic. He say in 2003, a multinational corporation experienced a security breach where attackers compromised a web application service account with constrained delegation rights. Here is how the attack unfolded. Initial compromise. Attackers gained access to the web application service account through a vulnerability. The service account had constrained delegation configured for specific database services. This is very, very good. Explosion. Attacker discovered the delegation rights through the Active Directory enumeration. This is another way. Enumeration, he is trying to enumerate the users in the Active Directory. This is a very, very famous technique that if there is a weak point in the Active Directory, you can list all of the users in the Active Directory. This should be stopped or should be closed. There is another way to do that through closing certain or applying certain group policies to close Active Directory enumeration. So an attacker who is from outside the network, he can, even though he is outside the network, not a member of the domain, he can enumerate or list the users in the Active Directory if a certain option is enabled in the Active Directory. This can be closed using a group policy. We have discussed this topic before. They used the compromised service account to request service tickets for the allowed database services. Without protocol transition enabled, they had to wait for legitimate user authentication. He should wait for the KDC to give the web server a ticket, okay, using the Kerberos, okay, so he cannot do anything unless the KDC provide the service ticket to the web server, okay. This is what we mean without protocol transition. So you should be using the Kerberos protocol. You cannot override the Kerberos protocol. Okay, impact. Access sensitive database within the delegation constraints, extract customer data from allowed database services, maintain persistent access through delegated authentication, detection and mediation. Unusual delegation patterns was detected by security monitoring. Organization implemented strict delegation controls, added additional monitoring for delegation usage, protected sensitive accounts against delegation. Anyway, this answer is not that good from my point of view. I think the best is the ChatGPT 01 answer. So this is how we can, or this is the test. It is seeking if there is any users or computers that have constrained delegation to other services. Okay, this is one thing. And the next one, we will see a test called Principles with Constrained Authentication Delegation Enabled for DC Service. Let's wait for a moment, guys. So let's continue, guys. Here this indicator is talking about also constrained delegation, but constrained authentication delegation. Here you are authenticating or you are delegating a service to authenticate to the KDC using or authenticate to the domain using different protocol than the Kerberos. So for example, here we can use NTLM to authenticate to the domain instead of Kerberos. So this is a security issue. Every service account or computer that has delegated or constrained delegation, you should use the Kerberos as the main protocol for authentication. So let's see here the answer, or let's see the description. The indicator looks for principals, computer or users that have constrained delegation to talk to another service for a service especially running on a DC. So he's talking to a service running on a DC. Okay, if an attacker can create such a delegation, they can authenticate to that service using any user that is not protected against delegation. Okay, even though here is talking about constrained authentication delegation, here he's talking about I think here is not constrained delegation, so he's specifying that here is using Kerberos. I think he's not using other service. So I have mistaken. Here we are talking about a user or service account or a computer account that can talk to another service, okay, using a certain authentication protocol. Okay, constrained authentication delegation. Okay, so you are constraining or specifying a certain protocol for authentication. Let's see an example also to explain that. Constrained delegations allow the service to act on behalf of an authenticated user. We know all of this. While it is sometimes necessary and requires the user to authenticate to the delegating service first, delegation to such services on domain controllers greatly increases risk. An attacker that is able to compromise such a service can significantly elevate their privileges in a way and infiltrate Active Directory. So this is very, very critical, because here we are delegating to talk to another service on the DC. So he can compromise the service on DC through the service that is talking to this service on the DC. Let's see an example here to explain such a situation. We need a real world example. So let's see here how this can be done. Okay, so let's read the answer and see what does this mean exactly.
Answer. In the context of Active Directory, AD, for a domain named matrix.internal, understanding the implications of principles with constrained authentication delegation enabled for a domain controller, DC, service is essential for maintaining a secure environment. This feature allows certain accounts to delegate authentication on behalf of users, but it poses significant risks if misconfigured or exploited. What is constrained authentication delegation? Constrained authentication delegation enables a service to act on behalf of an authenticated user to access other services. This is particularly sensitive when it involves services running on a domain controller, as it can lead to elevated privileges if compromised. Real-world example. Consider a scenario where your organization has a web application that needs to authenticate users against Active Directory to provide access to internal resources. The application runs on a server in the matrix.internal domain and is configured with constrained authentication delegation to allow it to authenticate users against a service running on the domain controller. Configuration. You configure the web application service account with constrained delegation, allowing it to delegate authentication specifically to the DC service responsible for user authentication. User interaction. When users log into the web application, they provide their credentials. The web application uses these credentials to authenticate against the DC, which then allows access to other resources based on their permissions. Security implications. If an attacker compromises the web application or its service account, they can potentially exploit this constrained delegation. Compromise scenario. An attacker gains access to the web application service account through phishing or exploiting vulnerabilities in the application. Exploitation. With this access, they can create a Kerberos ticket that allows them to authenticate as any user who is not protected against delegation, i.e., those without specific restrictions set in their user account properties. Privilege escalation. By authenticating as these users, the attacker can access resources and services that they normally wouldn't have permission to access, potentially allowing them to escalate their privileges within Active Directory. Likelihood of compromise. The likelihood of compromise increases significantly when constrained authentication delegation is enabled for services running on domain controllers. If an attacker can create such delegations, they can impersonate users and gain unauthorized access to sensitive data or administrative functions. This scenario is particularly dangerous because domain controllers hold critical information about all accounts and permissions within the domain, making them prime targets for attackers. Mitigation strategies. To reduce risks associated with constrained authentication delegation for DC services. Regularly audit accounts with constrained delegation enabled, especially those that interact with domain controllers. Implement strict controls and monitoring around service accounts, ensuring they follow the principle of least privilege. Use security measures like Protected Users Group, which prevents delegation for accounts that require higher security. By understanding and managing constrained authentication delegation effectively within your Matrix.internal domain, you can enhance security while enabling necessary functionality for applications that rely on Active Directory for user authentication.
So a good answer. One of the things I focused on or I noticed protected users group. So if you want to protect your domain admin account for delegation, or you can delegate on his behalf, you can put him in the protected users group. So if even the hacker hacked the web server service, he cannot use your domain admin account or request to access resources as a domain admin. Okay, he cannot do that because this, if you put your domain admin account in the protected users group, he will not be able to delegate, okay, or to talk to let the web service talk on behalf of the domain admin, because this prevents delegation. Okay, so this is required for higher security and for high user privilege accounts. Okay, so this is the answer of Perplexity. If we go and see ChatGPT, tell him to also give us an example concerning this topic. Let's read it out loudly.
Understanding constrained delegation to domain controller services in Active Directory with a real-world example in Matrix.internal. Background. In an Active Directory AD environment like Matrix.internal, services sometimes need to act on behalf of users to access resources. Constrained delegation allows a service to impersonate users, but restricts this ability to specific services. While this can be necessary for certain applications, enabling constrained delegation to services running on a domain controller (DC) introduces significant security risks. Real-world example in Matrix.internal. Scenario: Web application server webapp01.matrix.internal. Domain controller DC01 Matrix internal. Service account SVC Web App. Objective: WebApp01 hosts an internal web application that authenticates users and needs to access directory services on their behalf. To facilitate this, constrained delegation is configured so that WebApp01 can delegate user credentials to specific services on DC01, such as the LDAP service. Configuration steps. 1. Constrained delegation enabled for DC service. In Active Directory users and computers, ADUC, the service account SVC Web App is configured for constrained delegation. The MSDS allowed to delegate to attribute includes services like LDAP DC01.matrix.internal and CFS DC01.matrix.internal. 2. Delegation settings. Service type. SVC Web App is trusted to delegate to specified services only. Target services. The LDAP and CFS services on DC01 are specified, allowing SVC Web App to access directory information and file shares on behalf of users. Security implications. Risk of compromise. If an attacker compromises WebApp01 or the SVC Web App account, they can impersonate any user to the services running on DC01. This means they could perform LDAP.
So let's continue, guys. I will read it myself because actually I have interrupted the sequence. If you go there and try to see, here we have stopped at this one. the LDAP and CIFS services on DC1 are specified, allowing SVC web app to access directly information and file shares on behalf of users. Security implementations, if an attacker compromises web app 01 or the SVC web app account, they can impersonate any user to the service running on DC1. This means they could perform LDAP queries or access file shares with elevated privileges, potentially exposing sensitive data or modifying directory information. The attacker could use this access to escalate their privileges, possibly gaining control over the entire domain. For example, they might create new accounts with administrative rights or change group membership. Likelihood of compromise and mitigation, I think. Attack scenario: compromise of web app 01 or SVC web app through vulnerabilities or credential theft. An attacker gains control over the server or service account. Exploitation of delegation rights: the attacker used the constrained delegation setting to request service tickets to DC1 services on behalf of any user or not protected against delegation. Performing malicious actions. With these tickets, the attacker can access sensitive data, alter configuration, or further penetrate the network. Okay, what are the steps to solve this issue? Avoid delegation to DC services. Best practice: do not configure constrained delegation to services running on domain controllers unless absolutely necessary. Alternative solutions: use intermediary service or application proxies that do not require direct delegation to DC services. Protect high privilege accounts. Put them in the protected users group. Add sensitive accounts to this group to prevent their credentials from being delegated. Okay, and authentication policies. Implement policies that restrict delegation for high privilege accounts. Okay. Secure service accounts. Strong authentication. Ensure SV web app uses a strong password, or better yet, a managed service account. This is very good one to have a managed account, because the password is, or a group managed service account, the password is rotated automatically. Okay. Least privilege principle. Grant only the necessary permissions required for the service to function. Regular auditing and monitoring. Audit delegation setting. Regular review which accounts have constrained delegation enabled to which services. Monitor for unusual activity. Set up alerts for abnormal authentication attempts or changes to delegation setting. Network segmentation or Active Directory tiering. Isolate critical systems. Limit network access between application servers and domain controllers where possible. Okay. Conclusion. He's summarizing. Anyway, so these are the conclusion. Okay, and additional recommendations: educate administrators, implement multi-factor authentication for the administrative accounts, keep systems up to date. This is the answer of ChatGPT 01, which is a good answer, by the way. If we go and see the answer of Claude, he is talking about, first of all, explaining each part: principal, an entity, user, or computer that can be authenticated in Active Directory. Constrained delegation, a Windows feature that allows a service to act on behalf of a user but only to specific services. DC, a server that manages security authentication in a Windows domain. Authentication, the purpose of verifying the identity of a user or system. Very good. Delegation, the act of bypassing authentication credentials from one service to another. Then let's explain the concept. Imagine giving your house key to a trusted neighbor, the service, so they can water your plants instead of giving them access to your entire house. Okay, so this is a good one. You restrict them to only use the key for garden entrance. Constrained delegation. However, if this neighbor lives next door to the police station, the DC service, and they lose the key, someone find it could potentially access not just your garden, but gain significant access to the neighborhood security system through their proximity to the police station. So here he is trying to see, or to get an analogy to explain delegation to services on a domain controller. But here, let me see, he is accessing the service to the plant, and then however if the neighborhood lives next to the police door station and they lose the key, I think this is not a good example. Anyway, let's read the rest. Service to proxy extension, service for user to proxy. So he's talking about the constrained delegation situation. In Kerberos protocol enables service to server authentication through constrained delegation, where a front-end service authenticates to a back-end service on behalf of a user. When this delegation is configured for services running on a domain controller, it creates a potential attack vector where compromise of the delegating service could lead to privilege escalation through access to critical domain controller services, potentially enabling lateral movement and domain compromise. If we go to a real-world scenario, here he's talking about in 2020, a healthcare organization experienced a security incident where an attacker compromised a web portal front-end service that used constrained delegation to access patient records stored on a domain controller. Okay, this is weird. We do not uh, store data on domain controller. Some people maybe put a SQL database on a domain controller, which is not a best practice, but maybe this can be the issue. The web portal was configured with constrained delegation to authenticate to the DC service for legitimate purposes. However, once compromised, the attacker was able to wait for legitimate users to authenticate to the web portal, use the compromised service delegation rights to impersonate these users, access sensitive DC services using these delegated credentials, eventually leverage the access to move literally within the network. Anyway, so I think also the answer is not that good from my point of view. So here, if we return back to the test now, we need to make sure we don't have any service with constrained delegation talking to a service on our domain controller. So we are not delegating any service to talk to any service on the DC. This is forbidden and it is very, very dangerous. Okay, so we need to make sure we don't have such a situation. Okay, now we go to the next one, Kerberos protocol transition delegation configured. So here, this is a very, very critical security indicator. Here, the indicator looks for services that have been configured to allow Kerberos protocol transition. This capability enables a delegated service to use any available authentication protocol. So, for example, if you're talking about a web server with an attached database to it, you can, as a user, authenticate to the web server using NTLM, not Kerberos. And then the web server can access the database on your behalf by talking to the KDC and take a ticket or a service ticket and access the database. So you are talking about two protocols. Okay, and this can be done if you have the protocol transition enabled. So again, we're talking about look for services that have configured to allow Kerberos protocol transition. This capability enables a delegated service to use any available authentication protocol. This means that compromised services can reduce the quality of their authentication protocol to something that is more easily compromised, NTLM. So we need to have an example to talk about this situation. If we go and ask Perplexity, but first we need to have the prompt. Here is the prompt. We can go there and ask it to use a real world example, and then we put this the prompt, and then we take here we go, we take the security indicator, here you go, and then copy and then put it there like this one, and then shift enter to have a couple spaces, and then we take the description, okay, and take it like that, and then copy and then put it in the Perplexity window, and then do like that. Control A to take the same prompt, ask it ChatGPT-o1 for it, and then let's do like that, and then go to ChatGPT to give him the same prompt, and let's see the answer. And then we can go to Claude to see the same or ask it the same question. Now we should have three answers. If you go to let's see the answer here and read it loudly.
In the context of Active Directory, AD, for a domain named matrix.internal, understanding Kerberos protocol transition delegation is crucial for maintaining security. This feature allows certain services to transition from Kerberos authentication to other protocols, which can introduce significant vulnerabilities if not managed properly. What is Kerberos protocol transition delegation? Kerberos Protocol Transition Delegation allows a service that has been authenticated using Kerberos to delegate its credentials to another service using any available authentication protocol, including less secure ones like NTLM and TLAN Manager. This flexibility can be useful, but it also poses risks. Real-world example. Imagine your organization has a web application that interacts with various backend services, including a file server and a database server. The web application runs on a server in the matrix.internal domain and is configured to use Kerberos Protocol Transition Delegation. Configuration. The web application is set up to allow protocol transition so that it can authenticate users via Kerberos and then access other services on their behalf. This means if the web application needs to access the file server or database server, it can do so using the user's credentials. User interaction. When users log into the web application, they authenticate using Kerberos tickets. The web application then uses these tickets to access additional resources, potentially transitioning to NTLM if necessary for compatibility with older systems. Security implications. If an attacker compromises the web application or its service account, they can exploit the protocol transition capability. Compromise scenario. An attacker gains access to the web application service account through methods such as exploiting vulnerabilities in the application or phishing. Exploitation. With access to the service account, the attacker can request delegations without needing proper authentication checks. They could potentially downgrade the authentication method from Kerberos to NTLM, which is more susceptible to attacks like pass-the-hash or replay attacks. Privilege escalation. By leveraging this compromised service, the attacker could impersonate users and gain unauthorized access to sensitive resources across the network. Likelihood of compromise. While protocol transition is not commonly used, when it is enabled, it should be closely monitored for signs of abuse. The ability to transition from a secure protocol, Kerberos, to a less secure one, NTLM, significantly reduces the overall security posture of your environment. Attackers can exploit this feature to request delegations without proper authentication, making it easier for them to move laterally within your network and escalate privileges. Mitigation strategies. To mitigate risks associated with Kerberos protocol transition delegation, regularly audit services configured for protocol transition delegation and assess whether this capability is necessary. Implement strict monitoring and logging around these services to detect any unusual activity or attempts at unauthorized access. Consider limiting or disabling protocol transition for services unless absolutely required, opting for more secure configurations whenever possible. By understanding and managing Kerberos protocol transition delegation effectively within your matrix.internal domain, you can enhance security while allowing necessary functionality for applications that rely on Active Directory for user authentication and resource access.
So again, the example is not that good, but let's read the answer of ChatGPT o1. Let's try to do that again. Okay, let's try to refresh. And then again try to read it loudly. I think it will fail again. Anyway, we can try to read it through the browser. Okay, let's try to read it loudly. Now we can go further and try to read it like this one. Okay, here you go. We have okay, Kerberos constraint delegation. Here we go. Let's read it loudly. Here we go. So we can go and read it like that and read out loud this section.
Understanding Kerberos protocol transition delegation in Active Directory with a real-world example in matrix.internal. Background. In an Active Directory AD environment like matrix.internal, services often need to access resources on behalf of users. Kerberos is the default authentication protocol used for this purpose due to its strong security features. However, there are scenarios where users authenticate using different protocols, e.g., NTLM or basic authentication. But the backend services require Kerberos authentication to access resources. Kerberos Protocol Transition Delegation. What is it? Kerberos Protocol Transition is a feature that allows a service to obtain a Kerberos service ticket on behalf of a user who initially authenticated using a non-Kerberos protocol. How does it work? With Protocol Transition, a service can use the S4U2 self, service for user to self, extension to request a service ticket to itself on behalf of the user, even if the user did not present a Kerberos ticket initially. Delegation aspect. When combined with constrained delegation, S4U2 proxy, the service can then request service tickets to other services on behalf of the user. Real-world example in matrix.internal. Scenario. Web application server. webapp01.matrix.internal. Backend service server. appsrv01.matrix.internal. Database server. db01.matrix.internal. Service account. SVC web app. Objective. webapp01 hosts a web application that users access via a web browser. Users authenticate to the web application using forms-based authentication, e.g., entering a username and password on a login page, which does not use Kerberos. The web application needs to access backend services on appsrv01 and databases on db01 on behalf of the authenticated users using Kerberos authentication. Configuration steps. Enable protocol transition on SVC web app. In Active Directory users and computers, ADUC. Locate the service account SVC web app. Open the account properties and navigate to the Delegation tab. Select Trust this user for delegation to specified services only. Choose Use any authentication protocol. This enables protocol transition. Specify the services on appsrv01 and db01 that SVC web app is allowed to delegate to by adding them to the MSDS allowed to delegate to attribute. For example, http:/appsrv01.matrix.internal, mssql/svc/db01.matrix.internal, 1433. Application flow. User authentication. A user logs into the web application on webapp01 using forms-based authentication. Protocol transition. The web application uses SVC Web App to perform a protocol transition, obtaining a Kerberos ticket on behalf of the user without the user providing a Kerberos ticket. Constrained delegation. The application then uses this ticket to access services on APPSRV01 and DB01 as the user. Security implications. Risk of compromise. Service compromise. If an attacker compromises WebApp01 or the SVC Web App account, they can impersonate any user, request Kerberos service tickets for any user to the services specified in the delegation settings without needing the user's credentials, access sensitive resources, access or modify sensitive data on APPSRV01 and DB01 as any user. Reduced authentication strength. Weak protocols. The attacker can force the service to accept weaker authentication protocols, e.g., NTLM, which are more susceptible to attacks like pass the hash. Unauthenticated requests. They might perform actions without proper user authentication, exploiting the protocol transition capability. Likelihood of compromise. Not commonly used. Protocol transition is not widely used, so configurations enabling it should be scrutinized. High impact if misused. If abused, it allows attackers to request delegation without user authentication, leading to significant security breaches. Attack scenario in Matrix.internal. Initial compromise. An attacker gains access to WebApp01 through vulnerabilities or phishing attacks targeting administrators. Alternatively, the attacker compromises the SVC Web App account by password guessing or credential theft. Exploiting protocol transition. The attacker uses the compromised service to request Kerberos tickets for any user, including high-privilege accounts like domain administrators. They leverage the S4U2 self and S4U2 proxy mechanisms to obtain service tickets without the user's credentials. Accessing sensitive services. With these tickets, the attacker accesses backend services on APPSRV01 and databases on DB01 as any user. They can read, modify, or delete sensitive data, or even inject malicious code. Potential domain compromise. If the delegation includes services on domain controllers or other critical systems, the attacker could escalate privileges and compromise the entire domain. Mitigation strategies. Limit use of protocol transition. Assess necessity. Only enable protocol transition if absolutely required for business operations. Alternative authentication. Use Kerberos authentication from the client if possible, eliminating the need for protocol transition. Restrict delegation permissions. Specify minimum required services. Limit the services listed in MSDS allowed to delegate to only those essential. Avoid high-privilege services. Do not include services running on domain controllers or critical servers. Secure service accounts. Strong credentials. Use complex passwords or managed service accounts, MSAs, for SVC Web App. Least privilege principle. Grant the service account only the permissions it needs. Protect sensitive accounts. Protected users group. Add sensitive accounts to this group to prevent delegation of their credentials. Authentication policies. Implement policies to restrict where and how high-privilege accounts can authenticate. Monitor and audit. Regular audits. Periodically review accounts with protocol transition and constrained delegation enabled. Logging and alerts. Enable detailed Kerberos logging and set up alerts for unusual delegation activities. Implement network segmentation. Isolate critical servers. Limit network access between application servers and critical backend services. Firewall rules. Use firewalls to restrict which servers can communicate with backend services. Update and patch systems. Regular updates. Keep all servers and applications up to date with the latest security patches. Vulnerability scanning. Regularly scan for and remediate vulnerabilities. Conclusion. In the Matrix.internal domain, configuring Kerberos protocol transition delegation can introduce significant security risks. Elevated risk of abuse. Attackers can exploit protocol transition to impersonate any user without their credentials. Potential for wide-scale compromise. Misuse can lead to unauthorized access to sensitive data and systems, potentially compromising the entire domain. Key takeaways. Use sparingly. Only configure protocol transition when absolutely necessary and understand the risks involved. Implement strict controls, limit delegation rights, secure service accounts, and protect high-privilege accounts. Continuous monitoring. Regularly audit configurations and monitor for signs of abuse. By carefully managing protocol transition delegation and adhering to security best practices, Matrix.internal can minimize the risk of understanding Kerberos protocol transition delegation in Active Directory with a real-world example in Matrix.internal. Background. Security posture and protect against potential threats arising from Kerberos protocol transition delegation.
Okay, so this is the answer. It's a little bit long and repetitive, but the example is very clear, and it is more clear than the answer of Perplexity. If we go to Claude and see the answer, you can see here he has give us, if you can see here, this is a diagram. Okay, it's talking about the client and the web portal using Kerberos, and then let's see here what is the answer exactly, so we can understand what this what's talking about. Here we have the scenario. We have a healthcare organization using the domain matrix.internal has a web portal, okay, that allows employees to access HR database. So this is good. Okay, now we can see here initial setup web portal service account. Okay, this is the service account that will run the web server, or running the web server service. HR database, this is the user. I think this is the service account and this is the database itself. I think this is the server or the server database. Configuration protocol transition enabled SVC portal account. So we have enabled protocol transition on this service account. We can see here this is how this is done using PowerShell on the ChatGPT o1. He is giving us how to do that through the GUI, or Active Directory Users and Computer Console. This is done using the PowerShell. And then attack scenario timeline, normal operation day 1, employee access web portal with various authentication methods. Portal uses Kerberos protocol transition to access HR database. So I think it will access HR database using NTLM, maybe not Kerberos. Anyway, so let's continue. Everything works as intended. Compromise day 15. Attacker exploits vulnerability in web portal, gains control of SVC portal service account, discovers protocol transition is enabled. Let's see how this will be done, this attack. The attacker uses protocol transition to downgrade authentication to LTLM. Okay, captures NTLM hashes from legitimate users. So here he is downgrading. For example, maybe the Kerberos is used to authenticate to both services, but there is the option of protocol transition, so he have downgraded it to use NTLM, maybe for both the web portal and the HR. So he's stopping the Kerberos protocol altogether. Use compromised credential to access HR database. No Kerberos tickets required due to protocol transition. Okay, maybe this example is not that good. So I think for ChatGPT o1 this is better. So first you authenticate to the web server using the Kerberos, and then authenticate to the HR database or the database server using the NTLM. So this maybe is a protocol transition. No Kerberos ticket is required to protocol transition. Impact access sensitive HR records. Bypass strong authentication requirements. Maintain persistent access, difficult to detect due to legitimate service account usage. The interactive, so here we can see this is an example. Let's see if we try to make like that, what will happen. And then let's stop it. So here we can see here we have alert, unauthorized access detected, warning, protocol downgrade detected, switch to NTLM. There isn't anything we can click on, I think. No, there isn't. So it's a very simple diagram. The client, the web portal using NTLM, matrix. I think this is not a very good answer anyway, so I think we have 1 hour, so we will stop at this test, but I think you all have already understand what we mean by Kerberos protocol transition delegation configured. Okay, so we will talk the next time about this security indicator principle is constrained delegation using protocol transition enable. I think this is the same as other one, but it's also focusing upon constrained delegation to services on the DC, especially with protocol transition or authentication protocol transition. So we'll stop at this point and discuss this in the upcoming video. Hope this video informative for you all, and thank you all for viewing. Thank you so much.